Welcome to the kickoff of our ZOiS online lecture series called What Social Science Research Tells Us or Told Us About Ukraine. This is a series organized in cooperation with Humboldt-Universität Berlin. My name is Gwendolyn Sasse. I'm the director of the Center for East European and International Studies, ZOiS in German. ZOiS is an interdisciplinary, publicly funded research institute based in Berlin, and we've been in existence since 2016. Our focus at ZOiS is on social science research on Eastern Europe, broadly defined, and we take research of science communication seriously. So with a number of different types of events and publications, we try to reach not only academic audiences, but also policymakers, the media, and a wider public. This online lecture series is also a new format for us. What we're starting today is also an attempt to act as a platform for showcasing and discussing research on Ukraine in an internationally easily accessible format. The title of the series, which will loosely accompany the German academic term, speaks for itself, I think. As someone who has conducted research on Ukraine for many years, I'm painfully aware of the fact that this type of research has long been regarded by mainstream social sciences as a niche topic. So in light of the events since the 24th of February this year, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, there has been a lot of international media attention on Ukraine. The ad hoc nature of the media coverage also demonstrates to me an even greater need to widen our time horizons and discuss the existing but at times overlooked or less prominently displayed research on Ukrainian society and politics. And not surprisingly, much of the first-class social science research on this is done by Ukrainian scholars. I'm pleased that so many of them have answered my call and agreed to participate in this series, despite the extremely difficult circumstances they find themselves in at the moment. The ZOiS Lecture Series thus hopes to give space to existing research on Ukraine, involve an international group of scholars, and bring students, scholars, policymakers, and other interested individuals together on a regular basis. We've chosen this Zoom webinar function as we want to record the lectures and make them available through our website, and thereby also start a small archive on interesting research on Ukraine. The response to the series has been great, and with too many people to have a sensible live discussion afterwards, we will therefore gather questions in the chat. So feel free to write in as the lecture is going on, and I'll pick up as many of them as possible. So let me also say it's wonderful to see familiar names from around the world among the participants. Please check out the whole program on the ZOiS website, spread the word, and join us on a regular basis if you can. You need to register for each session separately, but that's quick and easy to do. And now to the really important part, our speaker tonight. Our speaker is Dr. Volodymyr Kulyk. He's a research fellow, a head research fellow at the Institute of Political and Ethnic Studies, which is part of the National Academy of Sciences of Ukraine in Kiev. And he joins us from Kiev today, for which I'm extremely grateful. His talk has the title, What Have We Learned About Ethnonational Identities in Ukraine? Volodymyr Kulyk has taught at many Ukrainian and international universities, and he held many research fellowships, for example, at Harvard, Stanford, at UCL, at the University of Alberta, and many others. His research fields include the politics of language, memory, and identity in contemporary Ukraine, and he's also looked at media and discourse studies. He has published extremely widely, both in Ukrainian and Western academic journals, and he's also published a number of books. He has, for example, published in regional studies journals like Post-Soviet Affairs, Europe-Asia Studies, but also in many other thematic journals. And Dr. Kulyk is also the author of 3 books. One of the latest ones is, I translate into English, The Ukrainian Media Discourse, Identities, Ideologies, Power Relations. It was published in Kiev by Kritika in 2010. I've enjoyed working closely with you, Volodya, in recent years, and I'm very grateful that you've agreed to open our series today. So without further ado, over to you, and I look forward to your talk and to our discussion.
Thank you, Gwen. Thank you for organizing this. This is an extremely important initiative. I understand that many people want to hear something basic, something urgent about Ukraine, but it's important that we explain to everybody who wants to listen that what is obvious and basic is based actually on what is less obvious and what is less basic, and what takes sometimes months and even years of research, and which is often published in boring journals and presented at less than exciting conferences, but which actually informs what we know and what we can even take for granted, and what we can explain to people who know little. And that's important, that this research will be here, as you say, showcased, so systematized and presented by people doing it. And it's also very important that half of your lineup is consisted of people from Ukraine, because of course it is only to be expected that some of the best research on Ukraine is done in Ukraine. Yeah, and people from Ukraine, as all Ukrainian studies, all people working on Ukraine, so people on Ukraine have been sometimes neglected or streamed into a niche, and it's important to be listened to them. Yeah, so. What I want to do is to present research on identities. So what I will be presenting is a sequence of publications and insights in those publications, which move us from simple but false ideas to ones that are more complicated but hopefully more adequate. So I will present not just my own research, although I will include some of my research, but many other people's works which I consider important and consequential. So I will move from more essentialist understanding of identity in Ukraine to more constructivist understanding. And one of the concepts I will feature in my presentation is ethnonational identity, something which seems bizarre or maybe false to some people, but I will understand that it's important to understand that what people often talk about as ethnic identity is in fact ethnonational. And I will try as much as possible, given time constraints, to explain how research on Ukraine reflected, but also contributed to developments in identity studies more generally. So let's start with the first years of independence, and as I title this slide, point of departure, essentialism. So understanding by many scholars of what Ukrainian identity is, or what identities in Ukraine are, was not very different in the first years of independence from lay understanding of Ukrainian identity. So identity is nationality. Yeah, so ethnic identity is measured and correctly by nationality. So ethnic composition of Ukrainian society based on nationality as reported in censuses is the kind of adequate truth or ultimate truth about ethnic processes in Ukraine. So this essentialist understanding, so ethnic processes viewed as relations between clear-cut groups, which are kind of essences of ethnic identities, was detached already then from constructivist theories and empirical studies showing how identities are constructed, how identities are changed, how identities are situationally signaled. That was not what we saw in Ukrainian studies, both in Ukraine and in the West. Most importantly, nationality was taken as an adequate measure of ethnic identity, a single needed measure. We just know what people say their nationality is, not even what they believe to be their nationality. They just knowledge that is their nationality, and that we know what ethnic identities of people in Ukraine are. Two most widespread kind of literatures at that time were, on the one hand, on ethnic composition, more prevalent in Ukraine itself, on ethnic conflict, more prevalent in the West, where scholars together with think tanks, analysts, and political commentators, were preoccupied with possibility of conflict in Ukraine and other newly independent states between titular majorities and large Russian minorities. So a lot of work was done on Russian minority, on their choices of strategies. It was based on influential conceptualization by Hirschman. So like triadic choice between exit, voice, and loyalty. And one of the work was by Ian Bremmer, comparing these choices done by Russian residents of 4 cities in different parts of Ukraine. So how the share of ethnic Russian population, the predominant language in that locality, and how the tradition of relation between minority and majority influences and determine in a way the choices for Russians in that particular cities, from Kiev to Lviv to Simferopol. So the dominant choices discussed in this and other publications were either exit or voice, more of voice, so discontent and protest and insistence on the respect of accustomed rights and in a way privileges. Not much expected was the third choice, namely loyalty. So acceptance of the new rules and readiness to abide by those rules, and readiness to accommodate preferences of the majority and even assimilate gradually into the majority. That was not what scholars expected from so large and so privileged and so kind of sure of its rights group as Russians. Yeah, so. At that time, scholars of other countries already studied hybrid and situational identities. These identities were not considered in work of Ukraine. So groups were perceived to be kind of clear-cut and steady. Yeah, so either you are Ukrainian or Russian, you are not both, and you are not at one point Ukrainian, at another point Russian. So that's how we started. So in the 90s, the first decade of independence, like I said, there were many works on ethnic processes, mostly in the line of ethnic composition or ethnic conflict, but there were 3 publications, three parts of understanding ethnic processes in Ukraine, which I consider not only important and insightful, but also consequential. So they influential. They paved the way for new understanding of Ukrainian ethnicity and ethnic relations. So one of these publications is an article, and actually a series of articles, but I am presenting one by Dominique Arel and Valérie Khmelko. Rather rare at that time case of collaboration between a Western scholar and a Ukrainian scholar on new measure, introducing new measure of language preference and language kind of delineation of Ukrainian society. They call it language of convenience or preferred language. They define it as a language that a survey respondent performs in an interaction with a supposedly fully bilingual and fully accommodating interviewer. So an interviewer appears in your house and starts talking to you, switching between Ukrainian and Russian ever so subtly, and just tries to elicit what language you really prefer. And they believed that this is a good indicator not only of language preferences, what people really prefer to speak, yeah, but also a predictor of voting and political attitudes, including attitudes on language policy, but not only on language policy, also on relations with Russia, for example. So they presented this tripartite structure of Ukrainian society based on this indicator, on language of convenience. So Ukrainian society supposedly consisted of Ukrainian-speaking Ukrainians, Russian-speaking Ukrainians, and Russian-speaking Russians, because Ukrainian-speaking Russians were too few to register in this structure. But what is important is that first, Aurelian Khmelko did not believe that the language which actually prevails in interaction between interviewer and respondent is the result of interaction rather than reflection of true, undisturbed, undistorted preferences of the respondent. Yeah, so that interviewer somehow affects these preferences rather than just measures, just elicits them. And also, this three-party structure reflected new groups which were supposedly more reflective of ethnic processes than just nationality-based ethnic Ukrainians and ethnic Russians, but which are nevertheless clear-cut, so-called bounded groups. They are not, again, they are not hybrid and they're not situational. Well, you can say they are hybrid in a way that some people are Ukrainians by nationality and Russian speakers by language, but that was one of the groups rather than a mixture of different identifications and somehow a result of some interaction. Another publication was a very influential book by David Leighton, which was called Identity Information, Russian Speakers in the Near Abroad. Leighton presented Russian-speaking identity as more important factor of group making than either Ukrainian or Russian ethnicity. And he believes that Russian speakers, people who prefer speaking Russian in everyday life, will kind of coalesce around that identity, that it will become less important whether they are of Ukrainian descent or Russian descent. Their language will be both marker and group making factor of primary importance. But that also meant that acquisition of Ukrainian identity by Russian speakers was considered extremely unlikely. Unlike in the Baltic states with which Leighton compared Ukraine and also Kazakhstan, he believed that in Ukraine, this acquisition of identity and assimilation into Ukrainian identity will not happen en masse. Yeah, so it was similar to Aurelian Khmelko in the belief that language preference will become of predominant importance in kind of structuring Ukrainian society and shaping ethnic relations in Ukrainian society. At the same time, there was another article by Paul Peary published in Europe Asia Studies in 1996, which was less influential, unfortunately, because it deserved to be very influential and very determining the future path of research on ethnic relations in Ukraine. But it took years for people to kind of fully find it and fully absorb what it was saying. It was saying that starting from the Soviet times in Ukraine, pure Ukrainian and Russian identities were not only possible options, also very widespread were hybrid identifications, so both Ukrainian and Russians, but also non-ethnic identification. So people identify, for example, as Soviet people, or identified by the regional locality where they live. So that was a kind of a response to perceived inadequacy of clear-cut ethnic identification. So either Ukrainian or Russian nationality was not something people were happy with, choosing between these two nationalities. So they tried to find a way to bypass this dichotomy. So they either combine or identify by other categories. So like I said, that was more in line with with research on other countries which presented hybrid and situational identities as very widespread and identities as constructed in the process of identification, but that was not at that time in tune with predominant perception of ethnic relation and ethnic identity in Ukraine. So this article was not as influential as empirical and Latin. Another important development in research on ethnic identities in Ukraine was related to 2001 census and its conceptualization, especially by Ariel and Kerser and Ariel in their influential book on census and identity across the globe. So 2001 census, the first post-Soviet census and the only post-Soviet census Ukraine has had so far, demonstrated a significantly increased share of ethnic Ukrainians, or rather people reporting Ukrainian nationality, yeah? And at the same time, a decreased share of people reporting Russian nationality. So at that time, it was assumed as shares of ethnic Ukrainian and ethnic Russians. So a change. So groups are there, but their numerical strength is changing and numerical kind of relationship. Yeah. So the ratio of ethnic Ukrainians to ethnic Russians increased significantly in comparison with the last Soviet census of 1989. Scholarly interpretation of this change was that it is re-identification. So it is not a large-scale difference in migration, like many more Russian out-migrated than Ukrainians, or it is not a difference in birth mortality differential. So like Ukrainians are born more actively and Russians are dying out more actively. So it is re-identification. So people who used to be identifying as Russians now identify as Ukrainians. So there was a very detailed analysis by Igor Stabelsky in 2008 of the census data, and he interpreted this change as return, so to say, to Ukrainian identity by people of Ukrainian descent who at the Soviet time identify as Russians. For various reasons, either because of mixed marriages or because of some kind of social mobility considerations. Yeah. So now they are returning to that identity which they knew all along was theirs, but what was somehow abandoned strategically at some point. Yeah. He did not assume that Ukrainian identity was acquired by others, by people who did not have Ukrainian descent, but who wanted to be identified as Ukrainian now in the Ukrainian state under in a different social context. That was still a limitation, somehow primordial understanding that you can lose your identity and then regain it, but you cannot acquire new identity without any descent. Yeah. So he simply said at the end of his analysis that it would be too unnatural to assume that. At the same time, Dominique Ariel and his co-author David Kerser in their book, where there was also an article on post-Soviet countries and then on ethnicity and language as reported in censuses, conceptualized census as contextual identification. So it's not just reporting of objective fact, of something which exists without that context. It is something which is revealed, not just revealed, but performed in interaction with census takers. So people do not just have identity, people display identity and perform identity. That was a very constructivist understanding of identities, very important and very new to Ukrainian studies. In his subsequent article on the developments in Ukraine during the census in December 2001, based on his participant observations in different parts of Ukraine, Arel insisted that people's reporting of their native language as Ukrainian, of Ukrainian as their native language, was in fact the assertion of Ukrainian identity, including by many people who speak primarily Russian. So they are aware and they want to present that at the heart of their identity is Ukrainian language rather than Russian, even though they are more fluent in Russian, they are more accustomed to speaking Russian, and they may not be even very comfortable speaking Ukrainian. So census paved the way for research inquiry into the meaning of different categories used in censuses and in surveys. But actually, the first such inquiry appeared already in mid-90s by Larissa Aza, a question on the meaning of native language. So scholars were aware that meanings of native language can be different, especially because the census in the Soviet Union and then in Ukraine did not prescribe what people should understand by native language. So the census just asked, what is your native language, without saying what you should mean by native language. So scholars assumed that people could attach different meanings, and people now wanted to know what meanings they are attaching. And Aza's inquiry revealed that the most widespread understanding of the two most widespread understandings of native language are language of thinking with 40% and language of nationality with 37%. So one is practice and one is ethnic identity. So native language is just replicating nationality in this way, but it's just a bit over 1/3 of all respondents. And the distant third is language of speaking with just 15%. At two more points in time later on, this question was asked in different studies by Mykola Shulhau in 2009 and by Nadia Boreyko and Theodor Moga in 2019, with a bit different list of options and accordingly different numbers, different frequencies of these meanings. But the idea was there that this category is conceptually undetermined because people are not taught what meanings they should attach to the category native language. And one conclusion which many scholars drew from that conceptual indeterminacy is about uselessness of this category, especially as predictor of attitudes. Since it is so undetermined, so why attach so much importance to this category? Whatever people say, Arel insisted, the state wants to ask about native language rather than everyday language, because native language which will give the state higher leverage in asserting the majority status of Ukrainians. So the number of the share of people with Ukrainian as the native language will be much higher than with Ukrainian as primary everyday language, and that's why the state strategically asks about native language. But that's the use of the state. For scholars, it was believed to be inadequate. It was believed to be partly replicating nationality, partly saying different things for different people, so we don't know anything about that. And that's why many scholars didn't ask about native language in their surveys. Unlike native language, at the same time, the meaning of nationality was considered to be clear. This reflected the belief that meaning of this category is exactly the same as prescribed. The state wants nationality to be about ethnic origin, about ethnic descent, and that the scholar believed very uncritically that respondents in the censuses and surveys are reporting just that. Why so why such a difference between native language and nationality? So the meaning of native language was kind of problematized, and the meaning of nationality was taken uncritically as exactly the same as prescribed. It's hard to say. That would take a kind of a study of scholars who used or did not use this category. But in my view, it's essentialist understanding that because ethnic groups are objectively existing, they are measured by nationality, and then in relation to those groups measured by nationality, all other indicators should be kind of measured and judged in terms of their usefulness or uselessness. And native language was considered wanting. Yeah. In 2013, I, for the first time, asked about meaning of both categories, nationality and native language. And I found that both these categories was perceived as mostly hereditary. Unlike other, for example, and other scholars asking about native language, I included the obvious option for many people. This is a language of my parents. Yeah. How do you determine your native language? This is a language of my parents or one of the parents. Same for nationality. This is a nationality of my parents or one nationality or one of my parents. So I found that for both nationality and native language, this hereditary understanding prevails. It is a majority option, but for some, these categories become civic. They report that they determine their nationality and their native language by the country they live in. For example, for nationality, in that study, 76% say this is nationality of my parents or one of my parents, and 16% say that it is I determine nationality by the country I live in. So the first evidence that these categories are not purely ethnic, but partly national. So that's where I started thinking that maybe it's appropriate to call them ethnonational. I don't remember whether I used exactly this term at that time, but later I did. So another kind of strand of literature presenting evidence that Ukrainian identity is ethnonational rather than ethnic is ethnographic studies of ethnic processes and identifications. These are not numerous studies, unfortunately, but I'm happy that there were these studies in different parts of Ukraine, which present clear evidence that people said that they were Ukrainian, not just because they knew their parents and grandparents were Ukrainian, but because they believed it was appropriate thing to do in a new social context, in the context of independent Ukrainian state. Abel Polesi and Anna Veligala presented kind of double study of identity processes in Lviv and Odessa. And in Lviv, for example, in very different contexts, Ukraine, predominantly ethnic Ukrainian and Ukrainian speaking Lviv, and very ethnically mixed by predominantly Russian speaking Odessa. In Lviv, young people of Russian descent saw themselves as Ukrainian and viewed Ukrainian nation as a civic community of compatriots based on common feelings of belonging to the nation, land, and loyalty to the state. That's how Veligala formulated that. And remarkably, these young people of Russian descent were seen by most people in the Russian group and both people in the Ukrainian group as Russians, but they themselves didn't consider it an appropriate kind of label for them, appropriate classification of their complicated but distinct identification. Yeah, so they saw themselves Ukrainians of Russian descent, rather. In Odessa, it was not so easy to kind of renounce, abandon, downplay Russian identity, since so many people identify as Russian, and almost everybody spoke primarily Russian. But very many people who used to be only Russian now felt somehow also Ukrainian, and some even came to feel predominantly Ukrainian, primarily Ukrainian. So without abandoning their everyday language. So again, it was a complex identity, but it was not something registered in censuses or in most surveys. Deborah Friedman, in an ethnographic study in an undisclosed town in central Ukraine, inquiring about the meaning of native language as prescribed by teachers and as received, embraced by students, found that teachers referred routinely in interaction with students to Ukrainian as our native language. But students kind of modified the meaning of that. They accepted the notion of Ukrainian as their native language, but in an interview with a scholar, interpreted it in such a way as not to delegitimize their own use of Russian outside of classrooms. So they said that Ukrainian is more the language of the state, that Ukrainian is more the language of the nation, but every individual can have their own language of convenience, a language of family, and language of friend circles, and so on. So Russian was also perceived as legitimate without being given a label of native language. Yeah, so they didn't give any single label to Russian, but they accepted the state-imposed category of Ukrainian language, but without the implication that it should also be the language of everyday use. And so these two studies demonstrated the combination of ethnic descent and language practice and civic duty or inertia of independence, you can say, in this new complicated identity. So people could say that they were Ukrainians, and people could say they were Ukrainian speakers, meaning Ukrainian as their native language, but for different reasons that most scholars believed were the case. So in addition to these ethnographic studies, there appeared a few studies based on surveys, which started perceiving ethnic identity as a kind of complex construct involving several dimensions. In my study, published in 2001, I introduced the notion of native language. I was dissatisfied with so many scholars neglecting that notion, not including it in their analysis, believing that because of its conceptual indeterminacy, it is analytically useless, believing that it doesn't contrary to what Ariel said, most scholars tended to assume that it was not at the heart of people's identifications, of people's self-perceptions. They believed that it was just a state-imposed category which people had little use for. So I disagreed, and I introduced a native language in regressions alongside of ethnic identity and language practice. But I conceptualized that native language is a separate dimension of identity. I called it linguistic identity, and argued that it is not reducible to either ethnic identity, which I at that time still believed was measured by nationality, or language practice, which was measured by primary language of everyday use. You could measure it either like Ariel and Khmelko by this elicited language, language of preference, of convenience, or by asking people what language did they speak primarily in everyday life. Yeah, so either that or that, a measure of language practice. But language practice was not the same as language identity or linguistic identity. So I propose these three indicators, and I believe they are all important. Some years later, Olga Onuch and Henry Hale published an article where they presented a more complex analysis and more nuanced conceptualization of ethnic identity as involving 4 distinct dimensions. And they included individual language preference, meaning we could say language of thinking or something, the language people prefer when they are deciding for themselves and they are their own. So let's say language of thinking. language embeddedness, for example, language of family or language of work. So a language a person speaks when he or she is with others. Ethnolinguistic identity, meaning native language, and nationality. Remarkably, they didn't call nationality ethnicity because they understood that they insisted that nationality was only part of ethnicity, just one dimension. And they argued that all of these distinct dimensions have separate impact on attitudes and policy preferences. So they are all important. You could not and should not reduce ethnic identity to just one dimension, such as nationality or native language or everyday language. Yeah. So this leads me to a number of studies inquiring about the impact of ethnic identities on political attitudes. At the beginning, in the early 90s, analysis of the impact of different factors on political attitudes based on regressions only use one measure, nationality, one measure of ethnic identity, nationality. It was assumed rather than proven. It was assumed to be a major factor of affecting political attitudes. So attitudes of ethnic Ukrainians on ethnic Russians were different, and it was believed that they were different in part because of different ethnic identities. Aurelien Khmelko, in that article that I mentioned in 1996, was one of the first to use different measures of ethnic identity and argued that they are more accurate, more important as predictor of political attitudes than nationality. So they introduced language of convenience, and they believe that it is a more powerful predictor of attitudes related to language policy, such as a granting of official status to the Russian language, or foreign policy preference, such as relations with Russia, either as quite foreign countries or fully integrated countries, or just one common state. A couple of years later, Lola Barrington introduced yet another variable, another measure, and believed that it was important, no less than nationality or language. It was region of residence, which was not just kind of compound of demographic composition. So distinct features of region reflect different distinct demographic composition of its residents. No, Barrington argued that there is more to that. Maybe historical legacies, maybe economic structures, maybe geography, something. And in a way, studies including region as a factor, a predictor of attitudes, did not dig deeper. Once David Layton told me in private, when we introduce regions, we just say we don't know what it is. Yeah, so there is truth to that, but definitely we know there is something. We do not want to mix it with language or nationality or age or education. It is something more than that. So even if we control for all other individual variables, there is a powerful predictor we call region, which distinguishes people living in the Donbass from people living in central Ukraine from people living in Galicia. So that was important to always include region as well. So in many analyses, we saw nationality, everyday or home language, and region included as predictors, independent variables in regressions, but not native language. And I was the first one to introduce native language because I believed, based on focus groups, based on my observations living in Ukraine, that it was important indicator, that it was important part of people's self-perception. Yeah, so that's why people called their native language Ukrainian, even though they spoke Russian, and definitely preferred Russian in interaction with interviewers that Aurelien Khmelko believed was important measure of identity. So I found out that if native language is added to the list of predictors, its influence, its impact become no lesser than that of everyday language and much greater than that of nationality. So in a way, native language was the most powerful predictor, or one of the two most powerful predictors, I mean, identity-related predictors of a wide range of political attitudes. And finally, Ongenheil, in the 2018 article, presented a number of regressions measuring the impact of different measures, these 4 dimensions of ethnic identity, on different attitudes, and found that different measures primarily affect different attitudes. So you cannot say that they are all measuring the same, because, for example, for protest, one dimension is more important, and for foreign policy orientation, another dimension is more important. So they're not about the same. These attitudes are primarily related to different dimensions of a complex phenomenon of ethnic identity. And finally, let's talk about change of identity and how this change affects political attitudes. The most important kind of landmark urging scholars to measure identity change was 2014 cataclysm, both Euromaidan and the annexation of Crimea and the war in the Donbass. So important social change, scholars expected to be reflected in identity change. Different studies looked at it differently. I looked at differences in identification by nationality and native language and found a gradual shift, rather rapid, from Russian to Ukrainian, via, in many cases, intermediate stage of both Russian and Ukrainian nationality and native language. So I called it derussification, or even hybrid derussification, like bottom-up derussification. Not, I actually decided not to use that name in the title of the article upon the advice of my colleagues, because derussification implied a kind of top-down policy, top-down influence. Yeah, in fact, that was a bottom-up response of many people in Ukraine to the Russian aggression, to the new perception of Russia as an enemy. So they did not want to be associated with it. So they did not want to call themselves Russians or their native language Russian. So they first added Ukrainian to Russian in their identification, and then they abandoned Russian and only embraced Ukrainian as their nationality and native language. Even though in most cases it was not accompanied by the change in language practice. So they believed that they could become Ukrainian or Ukrainian speakers, people with Ukrainian as native language, without abandoning the use of Russian in their everyday life. A number of studies, including by Pop, Elikesh, and Robertson, Sasse and Lackner, and Brejko and Moga, inquired about the strengths of civic attachment, so attachment to Ukraine as homeland, or identification with Ukraine as homeland, differently worded, but all these 3 studies found a strongly increased strengths of civic attachment. So Ukrainian identity became more national than ethnic. For example, Pop, Elikesh, and Robertson found that identification by nationality didn't change significantly. It's a different story why it is. This finding is different from mine, which found that there was a change, but they showed that ethnic identification didn't change significantly. At the same time, civic identification with Ukrainian state, with Ukrainians one's homeland, increased very markedly. So this process of downplaying ethnic differences in favor of unified civic attachment was very significant and very pronounced. in the work of Henry Hale and myself on the usefulness of different categories as predictors of attitudes, we found that if we compare the impact of categorizations by nationality, native language, and everyday language before 2014 and after 2014, and look separately at Ukrainian and Russian category in all of these measures. So Ukrainian and Russian nationality, Ukrainian and Russian and native language, and so on, we will find that different categories are display different usefulness in different social contexts. So remarkably, we found that native language was the main kind of beneficiary of this change. People perceived it as useful in explaining what's happening to them, how they navigate their new social world. So Ukrainian native language became much more important in 2017 than it was in 2012. At the same time, for Russian categories, native language was less important. Everyday language was more important. So we found that we could not even say that one measure, or as Brubaker called it, one category set was most useful. Like, we don't like nationality, we can take native language, or we can take everyday language. No, we found that for different categories like Ukrainian, Russian, or maybe others, if you could measure for smaller groups, different measures could have primary importance. Like for Ukrainian categories, native language is of paramount importance, and for Russian categories, everyday language. And it makes sense when people who used to call themselves Russians by nationality and Russians their native language now renounce those categorizations. They need some vestige of Russianness, and calling Russians their everyday language becomes that vestige of Russianness. So that's why its importance, its conceptual and kind of navigational usefulness increases. And finally, in the current project called Identity and Borders in Flux, IBIF, by a scholarly team to which I belong, together with Gwen Sasse, Olga Onuch, and Henry Hale, we conducted a couple of survey experiments measuring fluidity of identities, situational adjustments of identity. In one experiment, we found that the identity context, so the meaning people attach to their perceived identification with certain categories, is fluid, is adjusted to certain situational signals, so-called primes, which will remind people of COVID. Many people kind of switch from predominantly civic to predominantly ethnic understanding of their identity. In another study, we found that identities people declare in interaction with a reviewer, with a survey reviewer, also reflect the identity of that reviewer. Of course, interviewer. Of course, interviewer never comes to us saying, "I'm an ethnic Ukrainian," or "My native language is Russian," or something like that. And he or she just displays those identities, performs those identities in their speech, in the process of communication with us. And we take those cues, and based on those cues, we adjust our declared identities to be in line with the assumed identities of interviewer, which is, of course, very clear demonstration of the situational fluidity of identities. Of course, we need more survey experiments to work with that. So, in conclusion, two takeaways. At the beginning of the war, we found, the whole world found, and Ukrainians also found, that ethnic Russians were resisting Russian occupation. Ethnic Russians, most of them remained strongly attached to Ukrainian state and supportive of the Ukrainian state in its fight with Russia. On a positive note, we can say that most people were not so surprised. Many people did not any longer expect that ethnic Russians would be pro-Russian and hostile to ethnic Ukrainians, and there in those regions such as Kherson, there would be a split between ethnic Ukrainians and ethnic Russians, and it will help Russian invaders to conquer these places, these regions. Nothing like that happened, and the perception that ethnic Russians is not equal to pro-Russian is one positive result of these long years of study. At the same time, on a deeper, more complicated level, my impression is still negative. In many scholarly works, nationality is still used as a single measure of ethnicity. It is still not widely understood that it is not merely a reported ethnic background, but a conceptually determined identification by an established category whose meaning is actually changing. That it is not purely ethnic identity, but ethnonational. So a lot of work still ahead. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Volodymyr. Thank you for this really wide-ranging talk. And I think you've really emphasized the point how, on the one hand, fluid and complex identities are, but then also how categories that can be quite fixed, but the meaning inside them actually changes, and how people interpret these categories changes. And that has, of course, huge implications for our findings or for our analyses. There are quite a few questions in the chat. I invite others to also write their questions or comments in the chat. But maybe I can sort of abuse my position here to ask you about the term ethnonational, and you made very clear why you introduced it, and that you saw it as a way to combine, as a term that combines the ethnic and the more civic, meaning in that sense national component of identity. I think others and also other scholars have used it more as leaning towards sort of the ethnic identity category. So I think it's also in itself probably a potentially confusing term. I mean, would you still use it today, or what is the language you would use, or have you switched to kind of ethnic and civic in that distinction? And then maybe tied to that, as you rightly say, a lot of surveys still include nationality as the criterion, and quite a few analyses use it as the only kind of factor or category they use. But how would you suggest using it? I mean, always in combination. Once it's in a survey, it also feels hard not to ask it. But how would you sort of combine it? I think you hinted at it, that native language has become more telling, but then with that existing variable, we still usually have nationality. How do you think it can be sensibly sort of integrated into the analysis? And then I turn to some questions in the chat.
Thank you. So ethnonational, I simply don't know a better term. So I understand this complication. And actually, I can say, I work at the institute, which is called Institut Politycznych I Etnonationalnych Досліджень, and I never liked that. And I'm happy that in English it is translated Institute of Political and Ethnic Studies, because if we call it ethnonational studies or ethnonationale Studien, it would mean exactly what you said. So so you understand national identity in ethnic terms. So you build your national community exclusively. Yeah, so I'm happy that this ethnonational, the meaning of ethnonational is not projected as a kind of intention of my institute. But I reflect two obvious kind of a combination of two obvious parts. Yeah, there is an ethnic part and there is a national part. And maybe we could write it via dash, but I don't think it will help much. So some people will listen to what you say. So I always precede the use of the term with an explanation what it is. And some people still ignore what I'm saying and then presume, aha, so your nation building is exclusive. So I don't know how to help those who don't listen. So I would love to have a different term which would convey this meaning of a combination of two parts, but which did not have that implication of an exclusive nation building. I just don't know what the term is. So I'm still using that one. If there is a better term, I will consider switching. In terms of the use of category and nationality, basically, if we need one question, we better not use nationality. Nationality ceased to be, I mean, one question for ethnicity. Nationality is definitely now predominantly a measure of national identity rather than ethnic identity. No wonder it's something like 92% of respondents in all studies say they are Ukrainian by nationality. And maybe after this war, it will be even more. So if everybody is Ukrainian, what use of the term for ethnic identification, which we definitely know is still diverse. Yeah, so right now, I believe that it is a measure of national identity, and the rejection of Ukrainian identity is rejection of Ukrainian national identity. So kind of leaning to opposition to Ukrainian national identity, opposition to Ukrainian national building project. Until this war, I would say it's kind of pro-Russian attitude rather, or maybe pro-Hungarian, for Hungarians or something. Yeah, so clearly the kind of distinct and opposing choice, rather in national and political even terms. After this war, I don't know if anybody would be courageous enough or reckless enough to call themselves Russians in Ukraine. In popular discourse, in official discourse, the term Russian has not been used for a while to refer to people in Ukraine. It is now completely relocated to people in Russia. So if we ask, but what is your nationality? Some 2 to 3 to 5% still said their nationality was Russian. Maybe they will be no longer, but it is not a good measure of ethnic identity. So I would say if you need one measure, we better ask about native language. Precisely because it combines that perception of relation to ethnic origin, but also relation to ethnic practice. It is a kind of a good compromise measure. But if we want a more complicated, more nuanced understanding, we better ask 3 questions and then see how identification by each of these categories affect attitudes differently.
Thank you very much. And there was a question in the chat by Larissa, which goes in a similar direction. I don't know if you want to expand a bit on what you just said. And she asks, given the existing surveys like World Value Survey, Social Survey, and so on, what do you think would be an ideal operationalization for the ethno-national identity, which could be used by empirical studies to capture one's identity? Perhaps it also means immediately also in comparison to other settings, not to make it also comparable.
So again, it depends on how deep you want to dig. How much money you have to include different questions. Yeah, sometimes scholars want just 2 or 3 questions, and by the way, sometimes nationality is given for free, like by keys. Yeah, so you don't want to waste money on asking something more nuanced. But seriously, you definitely want a question of native language. And at a bare minimum, you need 3 questions: nationality, native language, and everyday language, either measured as this preferred language by keys, or simply asked what language do you primarily use in everyday life, or what language do you primarily use at home, for example, something like that. Yeah, I believe the language of everyday life is preferred categories identification, preferred measure to any language by particular practice, like home or work or with friends, because every language is a general, it's the general designation of my language preference, my language practice, which is resonant in public discourse. Like some people are Russian speakers or Ukrainian speakers because they are believed to be using this language across the situation in reflectance of their own preferences rather than imposed by the environment. Yeah, so I believe this is important. But if you have more money and more wish to dig to look for nuances, definitely a question of on a scale on a scale from 1 to 10, for example, do you consider how much you consider yourself Ukrainian, for example? Yeah, because there is one important difference. If people are asked about how they determine their nationality, they say by nationality of their parents predominantly. So nationality is perceived as a hereditary category. But if people are asked what is most important for being Ukrainian, people do not say being of Ukrainian origin. People do not say being speaking Ukrainian language. People say living in Ukraine, or having Ukrainian citizenship, or abiding by Ukrainian laws, or respecting Ukrainian institutions. So civic understanding of Ukrainian identity already predominant. So we need a separate way of checking it, measuring it, without relating to the category nationality, which is still believed to be predominantly hereditary. So we need a separate measurement of Ukrainian nationality, of nationality, meaning Ukrainian versus Russian versus both, and measure of Ukrainianness, or measure, it can be the scale to what an extent you consider yourself to be Ukrainian, or it can be the salience of Ukrainian identity in relation to other identities. It can be, as for example, in relation to other territorial identity as a Ukrainian citizen versus local versus regional versus post-Soviet versus European versus global identities. This is one way, as I call it, different scale, a scale of different territorial identities, or identity different of any kind. So I use it like that. I'm giving the respondents a list of 20 words, 20 kind of characteristics, including ethnic, religious, linguistic, social, ideological, different kinds of what is prominent in public discourse, and say of these 20, which are no more than 3 that best characterize you. And I see that Ukrainian identity is the most salient of this, and increasingly the most salient. So like 7 years ago, it was still on a level with gender identity, especially for women. Their gender identity was as salient as their Ukrainian identity. Now it is twice less salient. Yeah, so Ukrainian identity is now number one, not challenged by any other.
Thank you. Also, another question by Yoshiko, also on measuring Ukrainian national identity. She asks, given all the different options for measuring Ukrainian national identity you discussed, what is the best measure for predicting the willingness to fight for Ukraine at the moment? So how do we also measure something like the morale element?
Here I would say it is primarily about national identity rather than ethnic identity. So we need a measure, but not this all-embracing comprehensive measure such as nationality. I would say maybe the scale of attachment to Ukraine, the scale of identification as Ukrainian, something like that would be better. But we could also look, I cannot say at the moment, we could also look at these different dimensions of identity in Onoch and Hale paper. So maybe one of their dependent variables is something like readiness to fight or to support or something. So maybe their analysis, which is very nuanced, could tell us what dimension of the 4 dimensions of ethnic identities they use is most useful for measuring that. I would say of that dimension, I would suggest it's nationality, because nationality is measure of national identity as an ethnic identity. But because it's so widespread, it's so hegemonic, so maybe so many people would say they are Ukrainian just because everybody says so, rather than because they feel so. So we probably need to combine that with some scale of attachment to Ukraine.
Yes, thank you. Oksana is asking a more historical question and saying, why did the Soviet system, with all its measures really against the Ukrainian language, ultimately fail to forge a Soviet Russian-speaking language in Ukraine?
I would say primarily because the Soviet policies were not consistent. Soviet policies started in the 20s with indigenization, Koreanization in Ukrainization. Yeah, so Ukrainian language was promoted, was in many practices even imposed on Russian speakers in the cities. Then the priorities were reversed, and Russian became recognized as the most useful, as the most prestigious, as the most progressive, so to say. Yeah, and so increasingly people were encouraged or even required to use Russian if they wanted social mobility, and of course it was officially kind of inculcated as the most useful for friendship of the people, for traveling across the country, for understanding people in other parts of the USSR and so on. But the Soviet regime never actually abandoned recognition of separate languages, including Ukrainian, and granting some facilities like schools and theaters and newspapers. So all of that was available. I'm for one is a product of that. I was born, because I was born in the countryside. I went to Ukrainian school, which was the only school in my village, and until the age of 13, I never when I came to study in a boarding school in Kiev, I never even heard much of Russian, maybe on radio, yeah, on television, but even on radio. Most of the programming was in Ukrainian, unlike in television, it was mostly in Russian. So schools were teaching in Ukrainian, theaters in many cities were in both, there were theaters in Russian and in Ukrainian. Newspapers were in both languages. So a lot of facilities to help people use and know and remember and support the Ukrainian language was available, even though official discourse progressively kind of discouraged them to adhere to that language and to make use of those facilities. But I don't know, maybe it was just this period of discouraging the use of Ukrainian was too short. Or maybe Ukrainians were too stubborn, especially because there were regional differences. In Western Ukraine, the memory of nationalist struggle was way too fresh, and the politics were actually different. Yeah, the use of Ukrainian was much more widespread, and the state did not dare to extinguish that. And there was, again, the difference between cities and villages. Yeah, villages were backward, so they could be left alone. But because they were left alone, they can continue to replenish the Ukrainian speakers to the cities with all migration waves. Yeah, with industrialization in the post-war decades, very many Ukrainian speakers came from kept coming from villages to the cities, and they all brought fresh Ukrainian language. They were losing it gradually in the cities. Maybe the next generation never even spoke it in most families. But fresh people came and fresh people spoke in the streets, and fresh people bought Ukrainian books and newspapers, and so this was never fully abandoned. And then came perestroika, and then the process was reversed. So the regime was not very ruthless in that respect, and the time was rather short.
Thank you. Following up from that, I mean, you pointed already to the fact that in particular 2014 was sort of a tipping point as well, among other things, for identity formation or for how people related to categories. Julie's asking, to what extent did Ukrainian government policies or language laws affect identity formation? And maybe we can broaden it out a little and think over the longer trajectory. I mean, is it really sort of these certain crisis moments, or is there also other factors driving this sort of more gradually?
I believe language policy was a strange kind, or maybe not strange, peculiar combination of moments of crisis and overt fierce confrontation and a gradual change. So we know that, for example, the adoption of 2012 language law was a moment of crisis. There were fierce protests. There was a very sharp split in the parliament. There was widespread opposition and indignation among people concerned about Ukrainian. But at the same time, even that law did not change the gradual shift from Russian to Ukrainian in official domain, yeah, in the public sector. So under all presidents, regardless of their, we could classify presidents like Kravchuk and Yushchenko and Poroshenko more pro-Ukrainian language, and Kuchma, for example, and Yanukovych more pro-Russian language, especially Yanukovych. But that's very kind of crude. The gradual shift toward Ukrainian in education, and then in the media and in public administration actually continued under all presidents, at different speed, in different kind of nuances, but definitely that process resulted in a bilingual state with a rather at least on the surface, Ukrainian speaking public domain, and this post-2014 developments only kind of I don't want to culminate it, solidified those developments. So Ukrainian society expected, that's a paradoxical feature. Ukrainian society wants to continue speaking whatever language people prefer, and at the same time wants the state to gradually introduce Ukrainian, gradually. Yeah, so it is open to this introduction of Ukrainian, but it is resentful of what it considers imposition, kind of violation of the freedom of choice. Yeah, so and in 2014, the demand for more Ukrainian became stronger, and the state responded with a set of measures such as like quotas in the media. Yeah, and then the shift in language of education, and then a comprehensive language law of 2019, which found what I consider a compromise response to this paradox of wanting more Ukrainian from the state, but wanting as much Russian as I want in my own life. Yeah, so this compromise is the imposition of Ukrainian as a language of certain practices rather than certain people. So a lot of commentary and a lot of criticism was related to this introduction of Ukrainian in services, yeah, in sfera obsluhovania. But it is actually a very good compromise, because it says we do not care about what language people speak when they're in their private life, when they, even the personal among themselves. But when an Ukrainian-speaking customers wants service in Ukrainian, he or she should be given that service, and it's not about language choice by a salesperson. It's about their professional duty, their professional competency. So they are obliged to know Ukrainian and use it when servicing, only when servicing those people who prefer that language. So my survey data shows that it enjoys considerable support of the population. So when asked directly whether they believe that Ukrainians, public servants and separately people in services and sales must use Ukrainian when responding to Ukrainian-speaking customers, a majority of respondents say yes. So they believe it is important. So as long as nobody goes beyond that, Nobody imposed it. Not a single word in Russian is uttered by those people. As long as nobody humiliates you for slipping into Russian or being clumsy, not perfect in Ukrainian, or something like that. And I believe Ukrainian society is very lenient in that respect. But because of that paradox that I explained, people need some push. Many people say, okay, as long as I am allowed to use my accustomed language, my better language, I will be speaking Russian. Yeah. As soon as I am required to use Ukrainian, I will do, because I know it enough and I support it enough.
Thank you. Marie asked about the role of the media in the shifting constructions or in the meanings of Ukrainian identity. Do you want to pick that up?
Yeah, I believe the media was the first domain where this inclusive understanding, civic understanding of Ukrainian started. Paradoxically, or maybe kind of remarkably, it started with reportage on sport events. When there are national teams in particular, of course there are Ukrainians, regardless of their ethnic origins. They are fighting Germans or Americans or even Russians. Yeah, in both teams there can be people of different ethnic descent. But if Americans do not care, why Ukrainians should? In many football clubs, there were black-skinned scholars from Brazil or Africa, but they were gradually included in this category. Ukrainians footballers, yeah, for example. And when there was a national team, definitely one national team, Ukrainian fighting against another national team, Polish or German or Russian. And so that's where it started, when they say Ukrainians in this inclusive term. And at that time, it was not used in relation to ordinary citizens. It was not used in relation to culture. There was a kind of uneasiness about whether Ukrainian citizens, for example, writing books in Russian, are Ukrainian writers or Russian writers. So it was not clear, and very many people until very recently, maybe until 2014, definitely would say that they were not Ukrainian. And then they listened to their civic kind of position, yeah, so their stance on this Ukrainian-Russian confrontation to determine whether they were actually Ukrainian writers or Russian writers. So nobody will say now that Andrei Kurkov is a Russian writer, yeah, being such a vehement supporter of Ukraine. But gradually, media started using the word Ukrainian in civic terms. And that, because media is so ubiquitous as a discourse, it kind of encircles us. We are drowning in media, yeah, every single second, yeah. So media, newspapers, and then television and radio, and then the internet, and now social media. And I see that before the word Ukrainian was used in inclusive terms in political discourse, it was used in media discourse. So from media it came to the population. So population was okay with politicians using that word in inclusive sense because they were prepared by the media.
Thank you. And Anastasia is asking if you could elaborate a little bit on whether minority groups in Ukraine, for example, Hungarians or Roma, are also more inclined to identify with Ukrainian identity in recent years, despite language differences and probably also particular regional features that go with identities in that aspect.
Unfortunately, I cannot say based on my survey data because surveys with a sample of around 2,000 do not allow to distinguish between Jews and Roma and Hungarians and Poles. These groups are too minor, and in a sample they are too minuscule. So we cannot give reliable answers about their preferences. So we only distinguish between Ukrainians, Russians, both Ukrainian and Russians, and other, including all other groups. So what we know about other groups such as Romanians or Roma or Hungarians or Crimean Tatars comes from other data, from public discourse, maybe sometimes focus groups. So what I can say is that definitely there is a shift toward some embrace of Ukrainian identity in all groups, but it is very uneven. And it depends definitely on language practice. I can easily assume that Hungarians and Romanians speaking primarily their respective languages are not so easily identifying as Ukrainians because they are very different by language and in everyday interaction in their places of residence. They differentiate themselves from their Ukrainian speaking neighbors who they call Ukrainian. Yeah. So definitely one factor is kin state politics. For Hungarians in particular, kin states often interferes and very strongly in the interaction between Ukraine's Hungarians and Ukrainian state and the bulk of Ukrainian population. It insists that these Transcarpathian Ukrainian citizens of Hungarian origins are in fact Hungarians rather than Hungarian-speaking Ukrainians. So definitely they listen to that, and so their identification is affected by that. When there is no strong kin state like for Roma, or for Crimean Tatars, it is different. But then again, this experience of discrimination, I believe, also affects. If you are discriminated as Roma, how can you believe you are Ukrainian? Yeah, or if you are discriminated as Crimean Tatar, how can you believe you're Ukrainian or Russian in Crimea? Yeah, so definitely you feel to be different. Yeah, but I believe this process is general, and for small groups which are not related to any kin states or not related to any language practices, such as Belarusian, for example, which are dispersed and they are pure kind of census category without strong. Most of them do not have strong attachment to Belarus nowadays. Do not speak Belarusian language, do not practice Belarusian culture. So of course they are like Russians, will gradually assume Ukrainian identity, maybe still combining it with some Belarusian identity, or maybe just replacing Belarusian identity with Ukrainian identities, and many other small groups of people who are not related to kin states, who are not related to any institutions reproducing their distinction, will lose that distinction.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And Larissa is mentioning a good point, and she says the majority of studies focus on the impact of identity on political attitudes, but could it not also be the other way around, the possibility that certain political systems, preferences, and so on become a driver of identification, be it with any of the categories you mentioned? And I suppose it's particularly salient in the current context, and she says, my experience says that now people in Ukraine use their aspiration for freedom and democracy to choose how to identify.
Yeah, definitely it works both ways, and it's just that the impact of identity on political attitudes is a kind of powerful strand in research literature. Yeah, that's why because I was talking about research on identity, so I mentioned that literature. But definitely, political system and politics is one part of social context which heavily affects identities and identifications. I also mentioned that. So definitely, in a current, most obviously, in the current context, the war between Russia and Ukraine, in which Ukraine is perceived as just and Russia as unjust, yeah, greatly encourages people to identify as Ukrainians. That's obvious. Definitely, as I mentioned, politics of kin states. If they insist on this ethnic identification identification of minorities that helps to preserve that identification. And they help to run facilities such as schools and theaters and newspapers and political parties, distinguishing those groups from the bulk of the population. Definitely that helps to preserve the identity. But democracy itself allows for pluralism of identifications, and if nobody is discriminated for their ethnic descent or for their language, if nobody is prosecuted, that definitely helps to preserve diversity of identity. But at the same time, when there is no discrimination, it is easier to blend with the mainstream. So if you are discriminated on the basis of your distinct identity, then you may be wanting to shun that identity, to renounce it in favor to become like everybody else. But at the same time, you may remember that you are distant, and that's why it matters. That's obviously one factor for Roma, one factor for Jews, one factor for Crimean Tatars.
Thank you. And maybe we take one last question and then end there. Mikhailo is asking, misconceptions of the identity landscape in Ukraine have had massive policy implications, both in the West, where Ukraine was seen as a hopelessly divided country, and in Russia. So Putin seems to have believed that Russian speakers equal pro-Russian citizens. Have we now overcome the stereotypical misconception? Volodya, please tell us.
We have. I don't know about Putin. Maybe he's learning the hard way that Russian speakers are not actually Russians. That they do not want to welcome him and do not want to greet him with flowers, but rather with Kalashnikovs. So and those proverbial bottles of tomatoes, hurled at a drone by a Ukrainian lady, maybe Russian-speaking lady, I don't know. So what I'm saying is that at the end of my presentation, I mentioned these two takeaways, and a positive takeaway was that I believe the world is less inclined that 10 years ago, let alone 30 years ago, to think that Ukraine is divided. Less inclined to believe that Russian speakers would be pro-Russian. I'm not following all the commentary of Ukraine, obviously, especially that it's so multilingual, but whatever I see in English or in German doesn't, a bit surprised about the strength of resistance by Russian speakers to Russian occupation, but not much surprised about the fact that they are not welcoming Putin. So that lesson is learned. But now the very notion of ethnic divisions, so like there are different ethnic groups and they are very different. So there is divide between Ukrainians and Russians. There is divide between Russians and Crimean Tatars. There is divide between Ukrainians and Hungarians. So this is a more ingrained kind of belief, perception. So and in many cases, there is this divide, and we know there are many countries where people live side by side, but very hostile or very distant, very different in their attitudes, in their political behaviors, and from time to time finding themselves to be in confrontation with each other. But what my research shows, in particular, my forthcoming article in Slavic Review about what I'm provocatively calling, is Ukraine a multi-ethnic country? And I'm showing that the post-Soviet politics resulted in the gradual erosion of ethnic divisions, precisely because the state did not discriminate anybody, did not positively or negatively, did not insist on calling people by their ethnic names, actually erased the use of those names from public discourse mostly, did not continue the institutional distinction by certain cultural facilities or by official registration of nationality or by some other practices. That nationality gradually became irrelevant. Many people ceased to be identifying as Russians, many of those who still identify as Russians do not no longer attach particular importance to this identification. They just know they are Russians. They just know they are Russian origin. But it doesn't matter much because they still love Ukraine, but still fight for Ukraine. Yeah. So we should reconsider the assumption that the kind of objective fact of people having different ethnic descent have different social consequences. It doesn't, yeah? So social consequences are very different, and we should study them in particular social context. And this war is a good occasion as any.
Thank you so much, Volodymyr. Thank you for, first of all, again, for your talk, for your lecture, and for answering kind of such wide-ranging questions. And I think you really brought a lot of research and also your own thinking, of course, as part of that to this discussion. So thank you very much. We'll leave it here. We look forward to your next publications on the issue. And let me also
thank you so much. It was a great opportunity to systematize it and to make this narrative from essentialist to constructivism, from inadequate to adequate. So
yes, I have to say, I've never seen it sort of so condensed in one place. So I think this will be a great resource from now on. And yes, and let me also remind you already, or look forward to next week, where we have Graham Robertson from the University of North Carolina and Eric Ribbles from Duke University present projects that they and a larger team also of Ukrainian scholars are engaged in currently. It's called Data for Ukraine. And it's a big data project on detecting human rights violations and war crimes going on right now during the war. So I hope you'll join us again next week. But for now, thank you, Volodymyr, and thank you to everybody who participated. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.